Hello, my name is Eric Ford, and this is part 3 of 6 of Corporate Level Strategy. As we left the last segment, we were talking about Miller Brewing Company, and it got me to thinking, mainly got me to thinking I should have a beer. And away we go. I'd like to talk to you for just a few minutes about the hospital sector, and we'll try to use hospital examples throughout the rest of the slides to illustrate these different diversification strategies. But first, you ought to know a little bit about the sector itself. It's largely populated by nonprofit organizations. In other words, there are about 6,000 hospitals in the United States, and the vast majority of these are nonprofit. And you might ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, there are a few reasons. First of which was many of these were started by religious organizations. So if you've ever seen a Baptist hospital, a Methodist hospital, a Catholic hospital, you'll know that these were started by, guess what, religious organizations. And within the Catholics, you'll often see the different orders represented as well. Why were these started? These were actually hospices, not hospitals, when they began. In other words, if you had to go to the hospital, you were generally going there to die, and they had this hospice. There's another big class of hospitals that are called community hospitals. For those of you who are from Atlanta, there's Grady Hospital, which is a fairly large, famous community hospital, etc. So these are the ones that were started by the municipality, typically. And some were started by companies to service their employees. I mentioned earlier mill towns, mining companies, shipyards were often the sort of companies, steel mills, mills in any type, whether it's fabric, steel, anything that relied upon a lot of typically water power to move the machines, often had these. And why would they do this? Well, they owned everything. There's a fairly famous song that is 50 or 60 years old by a man, I believe it's Tennessee Ernie Ford is his name, and it goes something along the lines of 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. And what is he talking about? Well, 16 tons was the quota that you had to mine of coal working in West Virginia. And what did you do at the end of the day? They paid you in scrip, in other words, company money. So they didn't give you dollars. They gave you just, like we use our Flex, our UNCG, or wherever you may be at school, you can use your student ID. They've essentially converted that into their own currency, and that's why you have discounts and different things cost different when you pay cash versus when you use your student benefit. It's a form of scrip. And similar to the way we have stores on campuses to buy junk food, primarily, books, etc., these mining towns or mill towns would also have company stores, and you would have to buy all your clothing, food, etc. from these company stores. And guess what? It was priced in such a way that you invariably wound up having to spend more than you made. What did this do? Well, the companies then created credit for the employees, and this indentured you, more or less, to the company. So people were, it's a semi-form of slavery almost, indentured servitude, back to the company. With that said, these mill owners often found that people got sick and they made more money when people were well. Therefore, they started their own hospitals and clinics in order to keep people well. I live in Greensboro, North Carolina. We have a classic example of this, residing between Elm and Church Streets. If you drive out that way and start looking around, you'll figure out what it is. There's another big company in North Carolina called SAS that's very famous for its employee benefits, and rather than trying to indenture their employees, although they don't typically get paid as well as they might at other settings, they use these as something to attract people to work for them. Let's talk about the case at hand, Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser was started by the Kaiser firm in large part to service its ship manufacturing facilities, shipyards in Richmond, California, although it had large aluminum and steel plants, as I mentioned, in Washington and Oregon, and you can see that reflected in these where they do business. They've also expanded into Colorado, Georgia, Virginia, Ohio, DC, and Maryland, although they're not as integrated in the eastern part of their business as you see in the West Coast. And what do I mean by integrated? Well, first, it's the nation's largest nonprofit health plan. When they say health plan, they mean insurance company. So what happens first is you buy insurance from Kaiser. Then, in other words, to use your insurance, you have to go to one of their facilities. And they have 32 hospitals and medical centers and 430 offices. Typically in the healthcare industry, the hospitals and the medical offices are separate entities. All right? In other words, the physicians don't like working for the hospitals who tell them what to do. Therefore, the physicians typically start their own business. Kaiser is different. It owns the medical group. And in fact, the Permanente part is in fact the medical group. Kaiser is the hospitals and insurance. Permanente is the medical group. They do $37 billion a year annually. It's nothing to sneeze at. By the way, so we've talked about it. They own the insurance, they own the hospitals, they own the medical groups, but that's not all they do. Kaiser is actually held out by many people who would like us to see the United States with nationalized healthcare as the model for what our national system would look like. And to that end, Kaiser's deeply, deeply ingrained in government work through something called the Permanente Federation, I believe. I may be getting some of this wrong because the way they move this around is very convoluted, but they try to engage in clinical experiments. In other words, they're trying to demonstrate the kind of care people can get in an optimal fashion. I saw the man who is president of Kaiser Permanente, his name's George Halverson, give a speech, and they are going to map the genome of, I believe it was 100,000 of their members. And by the way, they tend to hold on to their members for a very, very long time. The typical health plan that I join, for example, here in North Carolina, may hold me as a member for 4 or 5 years if they're lucky. Therefore, there's a lot of turnover, and as a result, the health plans aren't typically incentivized to do things like deliver the sort of integrated care that would take care of me in long-term events. In other words, they're not really worried about my wellness. However, Kaiser typically holds on to people for something like 20-odd years. Therefore, they're very vested in ensuring a well-maintained population. The healthier their population, the better they are. And as you can see, here's some of their values. They have a big social purpose. They're quality-driven. They have accountability across the hospitals, the medical group, and the health plan. So they're trying to integrate these in multiple dimensions. You'll also notice on this slide, it'll probably be covered by my head, they have something called the Kaiser Foundation. And this is a philanthropic part of what they do. What do you think? Is this Kaiser model a fully integrated, broad scope, so they're both vertically and horizontally integrated, likely to gain traction in the United States? This would be a good question for you to send me a comment about. We'll count this toward the extra credit effort that we have ongoing during the semester. That concludes part 3. If you'll take just a moment and join me back here, we'll get on with part 4 in just a moment.